there is a gigantic paradox that is hanging over Europe. A continent of 500 million people that is rich financially, technologically, historically, culturally. Nevertheless, Europe is increasingly irrelevant from a geopolitical perspective and falling behind technologically, behind the United States and, of course, China. Now, why is this? What is the explanation? Let me start in the year 1950, when our European Union was created. I'll make a statement that jars not very nicely with the rest of Europe, but it is true. The European Union was an American project. It was designed and executed by Washington as part of a global plan to ensure that after the war, the Second World War, there would be a steady flow of exports from the United States to the rest of the world, to Europe and to Japan, to maintain production in the American post-war machine. And in order to make this possible, Europe had to be dollarized along with Japan. But unlike Japan, which is a homogeneous country, Europe had to become somehow homogeneous. The result, by the early 1950s, is what we now call the European Union, which began, the first name of the European Union was the European Community of Coal and Steel. It was a cartel. It was a cartel of heavy industry, of big business. Later, the electrical goods industry came in, the bankers, and then the big farmers with the common agricultural policy. Now, a cartel needs a common currency to function. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries have a common currency. They sell oil in the US dollar. They have a common currency. Because to maintain a very unbalanced disequilibrium agreement between the members of the cartel, you have to have a common currency. Otherwise, it's very unstable. Between 1950 and 1971, the European Union had its common currency. It was the dollar, effectively, because we had fixed exchange rates between the dollar, the French franc, even the Greek drachma, the Deutsche Mark, the Italian lira, and so on and so forth. In 1971, on the 15th of August, President Richard Nixon, who actually made friends with China as well, but just before he did that, he blew up this system whereby you had fixed exchange rates, the Bretton Woods system. Essentially, Europe was thrown out of the dollar zone. And how did the Americans pay for it? With dollars. Effectively, they printed IOUs, dollars. And they gave it to the Germans, to the Japanese, to the French, and later to the Chinese. In response, in exchange for what? In exchange for all this capital that was flooding back into the United States. On the back of that capital, there was financialization. Wall Street played lots of card games, and that came crashing out in 2008. And then what happened? The Wall Street banks were in trouble, but that trouble did not compare with a disaster, with a catastrophe for German and French banks. They were completely bankrupt. But we had created a common currency to maintain the cartel. But we had not created a federal state. We didn't have a treasury. When you flood the financial sector of Europe with trillions of dollars or euros or whatever, and at the same time you impose austerity on the many, the people don't have money. But the rich and the businessmen have money. But they don't want to invest it because they look at everyone and say, well, they won't be able to buy our stuff. So what do? They buy back their own shares. And you have discontent in the north, in the south, in the east, and in the west. And very soon, after that, the discontent brings about political fragmentation. And whereas once upon a time, we used to be able to imagine a federal Europe, a united Europe, the discontent that resulted from the failures of the cartel-like creation of the European Union to adjust to the post-2008, the conditions after the great financial collapse of Wall Street, That process led to today's complete and utter dependency. Thank you. Generally speaking, one mistake that many Europeans have made, and people outside Europe, they looked at the euro when it was created in the year 2000 as an alternative to the dollar, as a counter currency to the dollar. That was a mistake. So if the dollar is jeopardized by the rising euro, they will be the European, Mercedes-Benz and Volkswagen and Alstom and Airbus will be in serious trouble. That's why you have this remarkable dependency, because come to think of it, hegemons and empires used to be in surplus. The Roman Empire was in surplus. When they lost their surplus, the Roman Empire collapsed. The British Empire, when it lost its surplus, and mainly its loot from places like India that it was accumulating in London, it collapsed. The American Empire is the first empire in the history of humanity which gets stronger the more its deficit and its debt. But that's because of the American dollar. And the euro was always secondary to it.
但是欧洲本身，欧盟 EU as a whole, were it become one day, say in 3 or 5 years from now, become far more autonomous and independent, 就是欧盟能够更加 from the United States, 更加独立于美国，有没有这种可能性？
应该很难吧，在现在这种情况下。
Difficult.
Yeah.
If you asked me 10, 15 years ago, I would have said yes. But that was 10, 15 years ago. Now that you're asking me, the answer is a big no. And the reason is because, you see, you had my account of how the euro was created and how this gave rise, it transmitted the Wall Street crisis to Europe in a destructive way because of the architecture of Europe. It is the wrong architecture. But once we were in that never-ending crisis, starting in 2008, 2009, we had two fantastic opportunities to do what you said, Professor Zheng. One was the euro crisis. We could have said, okay, the only way to make this thing work is to federate, is to create, we have one pillar, one giant, the European Central Bank. It produces our common money. Let's have a government as well, a treasury that we elect at the level of a political union. Now that would have been a movement in the direction in which we are talking. But the powers that be, and I know because I negotiated with them personally, were absolutely adamant that that wouldn't happen. And the reason was the manner in which clashes within capitalist interests in Europe with the net exporters not wanting anything like that. They wanted to be wedded to the United States trade deficit, stopped it from happening. The second great opportunity was the pandemic, COVID-19, because they had to unify to some extent. They had to accept common debt, for instance, but they did it in precisely the wrong way. Instead of creating a common investment program to counter the lack of investment, Europe has not invested for 15, 20 years. Europe has not invested. And capitalism hates an investment vacuum. Somebody's money will come in, right? If you are not investing yourself, that's your fault. And this is, I'm saying this with pain in my heart as a European, because I do not see anything good happening out of my continent, because all the discontent, the misery, the poverty, the fact that the majority of youngsters now in Europe know they don't have a future in Europe. Henry Kissinger said what you said. Remember what he said? That it is a very bad thing to be an enemy of the United States. But it is even worse. It's even more dangerous to be a friend of the United States.
Do you agree with that? The Green Deal in Europe is over.
It was never on. Because Europe is very good at big headlines, large numbers, which are like balloons. You prick them, they go poof. the president of the European Commission, when she introduced the Green Deal 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, she spoke about 1 trillion euros. I looked into it. Do you know how much money there was in there? 27 billion, not 1,000. So it was all smoke and mirrors, as we say in English.